We are very excited to have Eric with us today. Eric and I met at UC Berkeley. He invited me to do a commencement speech at UC Berkeley, and I get to know about amazing works that they do at UC Berkeley with the Center for New Media, BCNM, and all the amazing works that he's doing. I realized that the courses he's teaching on critical making, I was super inspired by his work. So maybe I'll just read a brief introduction about Eric's work. Eric Paulos is the founder and director of the Hybrid Ecologies Lab, a professor in electrical engineering, computer science department at UC Berkeley, director of Master of Design, MDes program, director of Citrus Invention Lab, associate director at the Jacob Institute for Design Innovation, and a co-director of Swarm Lab, and a faculty within the UC Berkeley Center for New Media, BCNM. Previously, Eric held Cooper Siegel Associate Professor Chair at the School of Computer Science at CMU. Over there, he founded a lab called the Living Environment Lab. And prior to CMU, Eric was a senior research scientist at Intel Research in Berkeley, California, where he founded the Urban Atmosphere Research Group, challenged to employ innovative methods to explore urban life and the future fabric of emerging technologies across public urban landscape. One of the amazing things is that he also coined the word urban computing, which is very inspiring to me. And with that, he has accomplished many things across his journey. But with that, I want to pass it on to Eric. I want to thank you so much. We're very excited to have you. And with that, I'm going to pass it to you, Eric.
Okay, great. Thank you. Overly generous introduction. I really appreciate that. And also, yeah, clearly I'm a huge MAS fan. I mean, I've been trying to bring her to Berkeley. Somehow MIT stole her, but like I still have secret plans to like collaborate with her at some point. So I'm on the long game for that, MAS. So okay, let me try to share my screen. Yeah, I just think there's very few people that are kind of working in this intersection space of understanding how to detangle technology and think through how it can advance society, culture, but also critique the world we live in. So let's see, I'm going to try to hit some buttons here to make something happen. Oops, okay, hold on. I want to see if... All right, ignore that sound for a second.
We don't hear any sounds.
Oh, okay, good. I thought there was a sound. Okay, that's fine. All right, now there's maybe some sound, maybe.
That's awesome.
Do you hear something or not?
We don't hear any sound.
Okay, you don't. I don't need really any. I don't need sound to do the talk. So this is my test slides. This is not what I'm talking about. I did not do work in 1922, but you can ask me about that later. Okay. Listen, I'm a huge fan of not only Banaz's work, but I think you chose very wisely. This has got to be the coolest class right now. So I'm glad you're in this. And then if people were watching remote, apologies, because I'm going to show a couple of things I've talked about before. But I'm also a big fan of the Media Lab. Actually, during my sabbatical, I spent some time there. I just really respect the work, the people, and all those things. Okay. Banaz already gave a great introduction, and I think I'll try to leave time. I'm definitely going to leave time for questions. I can tell, like any professor, I have like different agenda that I want to try to talk to you about. So I'm going to try to kind of pivot. You're going to have to do a little bit of hard left turn, hard right turn, and then I'll probably stop. I don't think I can get to some like culminating moment. I hopefully can, but let's just try to talk through some things. Some of it is going to be some just stories. Some of it's going to be a little bit of walking back in history, and then hopefully I'll talk about some current research interests. So let's just jump in. I think this is in theme with some of the things you're working on in class, and what an awesome lineup you've got. I'm like privileged to be part of this. So, okay. So I'm gonna advance by this whole plastic dynamism that I mentioned. What am I talking about? I'm not oh, you're not gonna hear audio from this. Yeah, okay, sorry. I'm not gonna. Plastic dynamism is, I don't want you to think about plastic like the material plastic. It comes from the futurist art movement, people that were basically thinking about how you can combine this intersection of static with movement. And I think there's a lot of kind of artwork in this area. There's a lot of people that have like thought about this. It really is from 100 years ago, but I like this tension of there's obviously the fast pace of technology, but also this kind of static and calmness and how they intersect. I'm interested in that from a material standpoint too. So when they talked about it, they said between real and ideal forms, between new forms and traditional forms, we've discovered a form which is variable, evolutionary, and quite different from the other concepts that have existed up till now. We've discovered form in movement and the movement of form. And only through this dual conception of form can we give a hint of plastic life in artwork without having extracted and removed it from its living environment, which would mean arresting its motion. So, and I'll just keep giving shout outs to your like professor here, but she does a great job, like really showcasing this dynamism in the work, but also there's a kind of static calmness to it. Let me just do a little more, some level setting. This is a quote that I came across that I like, and I want you to think about the things that you do in your own practice, and hopefully this resonates. Imagine something never done before by a method never before used, whose outcome is unforeseen. And I would claim, I think that's what many of us try to do in our own work and research, and even if you're working as an artist. And I like that this came from Alan Capro, who really brought us, he was an amazing artist that brought us the happenings. He was kind of almost one of the first new media artists because he thought about that cross participation with people and place and kind of in situ interactions rather than things that were kind of staged or like a static artwork. It was very, a lot of dynamism. And this idea of hybrid, that's kind of embedded in a lot of things that I'm interested in. And that's this idea, Marshall McLuhan and many others talk about this, but the hybrid or the meeting of two media is a moment of truth and revelation from which new form is born. And I think probably many of you that are in this class are coming with different lenses, different ways of thinking, and that's this kind of hybrid approach. And it could be hybrid as in disciplinary, it could be differences in material, differences in culture, differences in all kinds of aspects. All of those are interesting, and I think that's where these things meet. I have had the fortune to do a lot of different projects. As you heard at the intro, I was in industry research at Intel. I was also faculty at Carnegie Mellon. I'm at Berkeley now. But I also like to publish things that have these two-column format contributions that you would check boxes with for a promotion case, as well as exhibiting artwork and design work in other venues. So I kind of try to jump around and sort of find satisfaction in both those kind of mediums. And obviously, I'm interested in this kind of ecologies, and this is I look at it as the scientific analysis and studying of interactions among organisms and their environment, such as the interactions organisms have with each other and their abiotic environment. Now, I'll just give you the cheat sheet to the whole lecture and how I basically work. This is my like, if you're gonna like leave, just stay for this slide and then you can bail. This is how I seem to approach most projects, be they scientific or artistic. I like to identify the core metaphors of a field, recognize what the metaphors exclude or marginalize, and that could be a community, a kind of interaction, a kind of affordance, a kind of experience, anything. Invert the metaphor to bring that marginalized element to the center. Much like Banaz, I like building real physical systems that do things rather than just have a glass screen that you tap on. So building kind of some embodiment, and that's how the work I like to kind of exhibit and show and have people experience and study. All right. A minute or two on PR. So I'm at Berkeley. Hopefully many of you have been here. If you haven't, please come by early and often. One of the things that we have is a Master of Design program. And basically the idea is to bring together excellence and innovation, these technologies, as well as the rich history of design in the Bay Area and Berkeley, and also social justice, which is in Berkeley's DNA, and activism, to create world-class designers who take an interdisciplinary approach to problem solving. And so this happens, one of the homes for this is this place called the Jacobs Institute for Design Innovation. Every time I show this at the Media Lab, they go, that looks like a mini version of the Media Lab. It was not the same architect, but it's a beautiful building. So please come early and often. Hopefully you get a chance. You would feel very at home in this building. It's full of studios and things like that. And where you can find me most of the time. In here, we try to think about empowering students to encounter, explore, and excel in designing emerging technologies. And so we think through not only students that maybe don't understand what design is, so how they can they can encounter it for the first time, how they can build skills in it by exploring it, and how they can excel in kind of creating the next frontier of new technologies. Designing emerging technologies. This is I'll give you a poetic view of this, which I feel they're evolving collaged elements of invention. It's where science, design, art, engineering, and imagination converge to create our future experiences, our platforms, our products, our culture, and our poetics. I think it's many people, and I'm sure this is true at MIT because it happens here at Berkeley, students are come here. They are excellent students like all of you. They are good at like, what is the problem? How do I get an A? And at least when they come into my class, I'm like, there's not one solution. It's like, there's all these things that are going to be emerging. So even if I could teach you everything about robotics or everything about virtual reality or whatever the technology is, you need to know how to encounter new technologies, collage them, deconstruct them, bring them into your own practice. And that's a skill that will take you throughout your whole career rather than getting you through the next 3 years. So, okay, let me just try to tell you 3 or 4 quick vignette stories to try to get at some points around how this kind of duality between kind of technology, science, art, and humanities come together. These are stories that are like multi-year long projects I'm going to try to tell in like 2 or 3 minutes. So I'm leaving out a ton of details. Maybe if you want to know more, you can ask during Q&A, but I'm just going to try to be poignant in some of these. So the first, and you can tell these are older projects because I have hair in them. So that's the first cue. So basically, we were looking at telepresence. And at the time, telepresence was really, it was expensive robots. They were for trained operators, and they were for specific tasks like remote repair and inspection. And we sat down and said, what if we inverted those things? So what if it was lower cost robotics? It was untrained operators, and the task was being social or hanging out. So this is a long time ago, so you can tell it's like some strange kind of bits and bobs here, but we did some kind of flying blimps, actually inspired a little bit by the Vivarium project that was at MIT at the time. And then also these kind of ground-based, we called them props for personal roving presence devices. And you can see kind of some experience. There's lots of like fun stories to tell and things. The point is, you probably recognize this as very much something you've used or is maybe roaming around even the Media Lab. That actually came out of work that I was doing here back in the 90s, where we're trying to think through what that would mean and what kinds of design elements you'd need. Technical things from a robotic standpoint, but also lots of things about the kind of way humans would interact. And we could talk about all those elements. I want to talk about how really some inspiration came from artists. So people like Andy Warhol. If you're ever in Pittsburgh, you can actually go to this and experience this. He had a project called Silver Clouds. You could go in this room and you get this experience of these moving kind of, you know, inflatable objects. It was a really cool experience. And I think there's something that connects with the kind of human spirit when you interact with these. And that interaction was very inspirational in how we thought about some of the things around designing these robots. Okay, Story two. I told you these were going to be fast. As mentioned, I was at Intel Research. This was, early 2000s. There was some work. This is before there were things like Arduino or any of that stuff didn't exist. Um, there was some work into some small sort of sensor networks. This was one of them. They had small wireless capabilities and very simple kind of networking. There's a lot of exploring how you could develop new networking topologies, how you could do kind of remote sensing. There's lots of things around power and battery life and a lot of different things. I looked at this and thought, what could we do in terms of designing a new interaction with this kind of smaller embedded piece of hardware? And we thought about how we could basically put some sensing on board and put some actuation. And I'll show you, these are Intel slides. They've got some kind of Intel branding on it, but I'll just talk through what this is. Basically, it's a small kind of watch form factor. You could tap on it and it would actually transmit the feeling of that to a remote participant. It had another interaction where you could actually swipe one way or the other, and then it would heat up or warm or cool down. So you'd have this kind of experience remotely. Or you could hold it and transmit your pulse to another person. They could sort of see your actual like pulse. Okay. So you'll probably, recognize this as this kind of technology, maybe even have one of these on you. Maybe you've used it, but Apple introduced this Real Touch. The thing I want to point out is when I did that project that was around 2001, so well before this happened, about 13 years before, people said, stop doing this stupid project. Nobody will ever want that. Um, and I'm just pointing out, like, it's not like I went and hung out with Johnny Ives and told him to do this. This was probably going to happen anyway, but sometimes you'll be doing things and you need to be a little confident in being contrarian in your kind of work and practice. And this was one of those examples. So there's a lot of you only get this from a longer career. It doesn't really happen in like 2 years of working in an area, but to have something where suddenly people are like, hey, you were actually onto something and I didn't realize it. That was really a powerful thing. And I again felt like that was inspired by another artist, John Baldessari. He says the best way to make art is to intrigue and be a bit seductive. You just say, here's this and this, you figure it out. And the point I take away from this is sometimes we want to do problem solving. I think if we're designing some system for air traffic control or for self-driving car, we should really make sure that it works and that's like the right information is conveyed and it has the right kind of cognitive load and all the kind of HCI practices. But sometimes we're good at humans as adding to the narrative. We don't need it all explained to us and every bit figured out. And this was very much the case, I think. You all know this with text messaging. You'll just send a couple emojis and it has a lot of meaning. And it doesn't need to have complete descriptions. So this idea of when you design things, if it's the right context, you don't have to answer every question. You can leave it kind of hanging almost as a challenge. I mean, artists do this. They make you kind of struggle with their work intentionally. They're not there to solve the problem for you. And I think that's something that's nice to bring into the work that we do. Again, another shout out to Banash, who does like a lot of that. All right, problem three, or story three. All right, so I also, again, early 2000s, we were looking at how smartphones could be kind of supercomputer radio stations with sensors. So rather than, you know, not many people make actual phone calls on these devices, right? We're using them for messaging and sharing things, but also it could be for environmental monitoring. So we were attaching all kinds of sensors. I know a lot of people do this now. This was pretty much one of the few projects at the time really looking at this. And that built a huge body of work that, again, I'm not going to go into all the detail, but I don't want to point out there are lots of form factors. We explored things that were attached to municipal vehicles, things that were kind of these balloons in public. We changed like signage, this breathe, don't breathe. We changed some clothing. There are basically probably about at least a dozen or more different projects that had different manifestations of how they engaged with the public. And we also built some of our own technologies. We also explored how it might be embedded in this is like for like a children's toy. So a little model airplane that interacted with the differences in the air quality or water or soil. And then they had these kind of expressive faces. This was sort of an e-ink, and it would sort of measure things. And again, most of the time people just want to read a number, see a number, or get a color or, warning. And this was, how can, at least in this example, how can kids start to create narrative by like just uncovering and exploring their world in different ways, and not about sort of fear and danger, but more just how is our world different than the things we can't see, and how can we make that more legible. We also developed a very early version, you could tell because the technology looks old, where you could actually get real-time information about the air quality where you're at. And it was through like a text messaging app. This is before smartphones, this is before the iPhone. And now, of course, we have these technologies. So again, it's thinking through what it would mean to have that experience. And we did lots of studies on how it changed behavior and perception. And even though the technology was very crude at the time, we were able to understand that at some point this will be part of your everyday kind of knowledge and vernacular. And so now we do have that. And again, doing research early on to kind of untangle that is really important. And then similarly, of course, we were doing things with collecting air quality using mobile devices. And now even there's a lot of work we did with EPA, but it's, part of that. Now they have that as part of their data set. And I'll just mention one other project in this like area where we were looking at how you could attach these to municipal vehicles. And so actually Gavin Newsom was actually the mayor at the time, and let me put all these things all over city vehicles and collect data. And there's a lot of interesting things that came out of that study. I'm also going to tell you, for people that are students writing research papers, we wrote this paper and it was just flat out rejected from CHI, not even really like receiving a review. And I thought it was really good work. Of course, I got grumpy about it. And then the next year, I just resubmitted the same paper and I got a best paper award. So that's how much noise is in the review system. It went from auto reject to best paper. So take that as you want. And of course, there's lots of things now that are like doing these citizen measurements. But I want to point out, this is really inspired by a person who is not technically a kind of scientist, Rachel Carson. If you've ever had a chance, she wrote The Silent Spring and many other kind of environmental, she's very much an environmentalist. She says, the more clearly we can focus our attention on the wonders and realities of the universe, the less taste we will have for its destruction. So kind of just making sure people understand these landscapes more. All right. Last story in this little sequence, because I want to get to some newer things too. Energy. Okay, so you've all maybe, right even now, you're plugged in, you're charging your phone, you maybe turned on a light, all these different things. But we don't think of energy as a material. And this is often an interesting approach, because as a designer, all you have to do is try to think through something that you don't pay attention to, in this case, just electricity. And how could we start to think about it as a material? And I'll give you a thought experiment. So think of someone that is like maybe a loved one. This was my son many years ago. If that, say he's swinging and he charges, collects some energy from that, and he brings it home and he gives it to me, and maybe you read using a light that, was from that charge. And my question is this somehow different than just plugging into the wall? And I say, absolutely. It's like, this is basically something that's a gift. It's hand created. It's from a loved one. It has basically an aura about it of something that Walter Benjamin talks about this, that, things that have some past history, they have something they're not generic. There's some meaning behind it. And in that sense, we started thinking about, not just, usually the discussion is how do we reduce consumption of something like energy or electricity? And we thought about, could there be new ways to kind of collect it or keep it or share it? And these are very much, lots of little energy does not an energy crisis solve. But for example, we made these things called energy mementos, little singular bits of emotional kind of parts of energy, like a hand crank or things you could shake, just small little things. I would say, imagine you have a grandfather or grandparent you cranked something and created energy with them, would you store it like on the mantle having meaning? Like that's what like grandpa and I made together. And I think it's an interesting thought of something that's kind of got that tangibility to it. We also did this as an art project, these kind of intentionally designed, kind of crude objects that collected little bits of energy. They literally stole energy from public places. So you could attach it to like a tram and it would kind of collect some energy and then you could use that energy. And we had a sequence of these. We could attach them to escalators or in the front of a car to have some photovoltaics or in like a public fountain. To be clear, we're not getting free energy. We're actually stealing it. We're like, but we're showcasing where it's kind of leaking out and where there's these small opportunities. And again, I would say we were trying to get at these ideas that now exist in a lot of mobile technology. And we were talking about at the time that basically people would how would you want to share little bits of energy? Would you leave some behind on the bus or would you share it with your neighbors? And there's a lot of discussion about what this would feel like when it's not just you paying one bill to a giant company. What kinds of other interactions could you have? The same way you share whatever text messages, would you share these little bits of energy? We also thought about how it could be represented on your phone, even in ways that where did I charge? Like, was it from, hydroelectric or was this from coal generation or solar? And now actually, in 2022, Apple introduced a way you could kind of do what's called clean energy charging, and it would sort of select optimal times on the power grid wherever you're located. So it's like a little bit of a gesture in that direction. I'm gonna mention one other thing that's like a little bit adjacent, but a little different, this idea of counterfunctional design. So this was a kind of design methodology that it was James Pierce and I at the time kind of put this forward. I'll say this and then I'll give you an example because it's sort of a little confusing. Counterfunctional design is a thing that counters some of its own essential functionality while retaining familiarity as essentially that thing. Okay, I know that's like, what are you talking about? Let me give you an example, because this one of the examples that we did with counterfunctional design was we thought about cameras. And if you think about cameras, what's their main functionality? Well, they collect photons, they make a picture. But what other things do you do? Well, you all know, we share pictures, we store pictures, we modify pictures, we print them out, we delete them, all kinds of different things. So we actually went and designed a bunch of different cameras that were functional that did these counterfunctional designs. And there's a whole paper on this we did back in 2014. I'll just say one of the cameras in there was called the prompt cam. And this camera actually, it had multiple lenses for taking sort of front and back versions of what was happening. And you could only take a picture when it lit up, prompting you. So it was kind of, some of our versions were like you could only take it when certain people were around or you were at a place. There were a bunch of different variations. This is one of them. Many of you, I don't know how popular it is now, but certainly for a while, this was actually what Be Real was. Or, it prompts you to take a picture. It tries to capture this kind of more genuine moment. At least that's in theory what they're trying to do. And we saw that as the value when we were doing this research project. This was before Be Real. Again, we didn't like influence the company, but I'll point out again, when I did this project with James, people said this is a really stupid idea. People want more and more frequent and more bits and higher resolution. It's like actually there is some value in slowing down or putting design constraints on this, and that's very much what this project was. Okay, so with that said, let me mention a couple projects that I didn't do, but talk to this idea of often looking outside your own discipline when you're thinking about your work. And so one of the things that I thought about actually came out of Andy Littman there at the Media Lab and a bunch of other folks, this project called the Aspen Movie Map. So this is clearly before any of you were born. I know that. And this is like a project. You could walk around the city of Aspen, Colorado. It was a laser video disc. It's like a cool, crazy project. Looks a lot like this thing that we got roughly 30 years later. It's not that we weren't going to get Google Street View. That was going to happen anyway. Aspen Movie Map started more as an art project. And in fact, it was called out by the US Congress. This is very timely because our government is in such a strange state. Is called out as the most egregious waste of taxpayer dollars. So it's interesting that there's the project that we use very regularly about viewing and moving through cities, and there's so much richness in that experience. And a thing that, 30 years later, Congress said, stop this stupid project. This is a waste of money. So I'm just pointing out, even the setup looks the same. I got them to send me some pictures, but you'll find this pattern throughout. I'll give you a couple more. One of them is Myron Kruger, who was a very misunderstood computer scientist and artist. He was interested in exploring body and gesture. And people looked at that and said, that's not computer science. We don't know what that is. And they just couldn't grapple with what he was doing. And in fact, clearly he was really understood that in the future, very much the body, position, placement, these physical interactions are going to play a much more dominant role than, the 1970s. This is like command line interface era. Even, I'm going to call it Twitter. We can have a debate later about it, but Twitter basically came out of an art project. This was started by the Institute for Applied Autonomy. They did a project during the Democratic National Convention in 2004 as a lightweight messaging tool for coordinating kind of activist protests. And then they were out of a job, wandered to San Francisco, ran into Jack Dorsey. He was working on a kind of sound podcasting company, and they said, you should really do this messaging thing. And that became Twitter. So a lot of things that people like to look at and you use every day. I'm always reminding people these aren't coming out of no place. And in fact, they're often inspired by people that have thought for decades, or often artists as well, that explore these ideas. The last one I'll tell you about is TerraVision by art+com. They basically, and people have explored this idea of browsing around the earth, like Charles Ray Eames, The Power of 10, lots of things. There's this natural thing about exploring the earth and moving through it. But they were before, very much before Google Earth started. And you can go, if I think it's on Netflix, there's a series that shows basically how this works and how they were in a lawsuit. And it's very controversial about what happened in this, but ideally there was some similarity. Okay. I want to point out all of those stories, and hopefully some of the things that I shared from my own experience are this idea of this clashing point of two subjects, of two disciplines, of two cultures, of two galaxies ought to produce creative chances. And that's where I like to operate. I think that's where I think some of the things from the course you're in are exploring. You're having lots of people come from different backgrounds and different disciplines and try to give that perspective. And again, I'll bring in Marshall McLuhan. He says, artists show us how to ride with the punch rather than taking a knockout on the chin. I think that's a cool way of thinking about how they kind of help us really think through technology in very different new ways. And there's a long history of that. I mean, of course, Apple has this story about the kind of Steve Wozniak engineer and the humanist Steve Jobs. Lillian Schwartz was a really amazing early kind of computer-mediated art pioneer, looking a lot at, really some cool things with experiments in art and technology, and really establishing computers as a valid and kind of fruitful artistic medium. I had a chance to interact with Virgil Abloh before he passed, unfortunately. So many of you maybe know he started Off-White, and then he also was the men's wear collection director for Louis Vuitton. Do not be confused. I do not. This is how I'm dressed. So I don't have like some Louis Vuitton background, but I connected with Virgil because he also has a background as he's a civil engineer and he also has an architecture degree. And he understood as a fashion designer that fashion is commenting on the milieu of our culture. And our culture is right now very filled with technology. He was looking at ways to explore how technology could be part of the conversation in what we wear. And we have a lot of that. This is stuff they were exploring at the time, lots of kind of things that you've seen that others have looked at, but it was some really even though I am not a fashion designer, all of their designers I got along with because we were all sort of trying to untangle how to be creative with new materials. My materials were just a little more digital than their materials, but there was huge respect across those. All right, I'm going to skip through some things that I did with some robotic performance group because I want to mention something about this individual, Mark Weiser, who many of you probably know. If you don't, he basically was the person that brought us, he coined the word UbiComp, ubiquitous computing. Um, he basically also brought us this idea of how we might interact with technologies in the future. He said, we'll have these tabs. This is basically your iPhone is your tab. He said, we'll have these pads. We obviously have iPads and other kinds of tablets and boards. A little bit less interactions nowadays with boards, but the idea is clearly these were, you have to imagine he envisioned this in the early 90s. So that would be like if I told you right now, how do you think we'll be interacting with technology in 2040? So it's a very hard ask, and he was able to get pretty much on the head what that was. And he was basically the director at the computer science lab at Xerox PARC. That's the Palo Alto Research Center. That's the place that also brought you really Ethernet, like many technologies used today. And they asked Mark to come. He gave a keynote talk at WIST, one of these conferences that's kind of a top tier HCI conference. And he didn't come and say, hey, I want to tell you how we need to advance computer networking and power. He was very much a humanist. So thanks to the Wayback Machine, I have a copy of one of his slides. And he says, here's how you're going to do it. And I'm just going to highlight, he says, start from arts and humanities. He talks about a lot of other things with philosophy and phenomenology and feminism and postmodernism. So he's basically saying, yeah, we could talk about technology, but there's some higher order things we really need to address as a culture. And so I think that's a lot of the things we try to do in HCI and in design and in new media artwork. Okay. I'm going to skip to some, this is basically this is one of the, when you give students a lot of coffee, this is how quickly they move through the research lab. All right. I'm going to jump because I want to leave some time for questions. So I'm going to talk a little bit quickly about some research in some wearables and then some new material, and then I'll hopefully stop. So some of this, one of the things I'll just talk about was thinking through wearable technology. And I've moved my field about every 4 or 5 years at something. So this is kind of one generation back, but it's good to be reflective of it. And the idea was to say, let's not try to design more glass screens that you're wearing. And so at least my strategy was, let's build out a set of prototypes that explore different interactions, different designs. So one of them was looking at how we could basically have non-emissive kinds of displays. So this is just using sort of thermochromic material that was woven in. And many of you are probably familiar with things like this. The idea is you could clearly, the main thing was to think through how your clothing could change, that would be more expressive. And so you might have things that changed over time, or you could have styles that change. You could also have things that maybe are driven by other data feeds. The main point was a really interesting discussion. Basically, I mean, this is what I'm wearing today. If you look around the room, everyone's probably going to look mostly the same by the end of the day. But what if you had clothing or things that responded and changed? Do you author that? Do other people author that? There's a bunch of interesting questions that we were able to explore. Another one was, could you kind of sample things in your environment and just kind of put them into your clothing? And one of the challenges was to use things that didn't require any power. So this was using some bistable material like e-ink. The idea was you could take a picture, or in this case, we had some samples, and we could sort of say, I like that pattern. And then it would not only power up the device, but also transmit those patterns. And so you could quickly change patterns. And the main thing was you didn't need to have any battery connected to keep that display. This is maybe not the most aesthetically beautiful, but it shows at least the interaction. If you left the phone in your pocket, of course, it could continuously power, so you could get some more expressive kinds of animations and things. And then we explored this through lots of different parts of the body. We did a fingernail. Could you have an expressive fingernail that sort of changed and you could actually interact with? We were trying to model it off. This is Total Recall, a movie from the 90s about could you sort of change your nails, either color or sort of kind of the expressive part of it. And of course, you could put it into kind of anything. We had sort of a shoe. You could sort of change the way it looked, have funny things on it. Another area that we explored was hair. I know I don't have hair. I sometimes wear a wig to demo this, but my students have quite voluminous hair. And the idea is if you think about hair, it's an interesting material. It has a very personal choice of how we style our hair, but it's very public. Most cultures, you see people's hair, not all, but most. It also is something that expresses your individual identity. It's sort of signaling lots of things about not just you, but maybe also a group identification of who you connect with or who you're sort of finding some commonality with. It's something you could explore different lengths and styles and colors. There's also an intimacy that you can, people often will even touch someone else's hair. It's a way of bonding. It's a very kind of intimate kind of interaction. And then there's also just the way you touch your own hair. And the idea was we were thinking, could we do things that explored how you might capture this and drive interactions? And I'll just in brief, we had a couple of different ways we could classify how you touched your hair as some kind of a almost way of knowing how you interacted with it. We could use some thermochromic materials to get you to sort of change the color of your hair. And then we could actually get your hair to change its actual sort of shape. So what would you do with this? I mean, for example, you might use a text messaging, but now the message comes through your hair, and you could feel that kind of on your um, like on your skin, basically. So the message now comes in, you need to respond. So you pull out your phone. No, you don't need to pull out your phone because you can use your hair to send the signal back. So that might be a way you could communicate a reply, basically. And similarly, you saw some things about the hair change that could sort of change its style, could change very gently, or it could change quite dramatically. This is Christy, who did a lot of this work. And she was also a performer. So this is actually, there's not like strings attached. She actually got it to kind of do quite dramatic. There she's playing the ukulele. But again, you're not going to be able to display the kinds of information you'd have on a smartwatch or a smartphone, but there's interesting interactions you can have with hair. There's a lot more to explore culturally. We just did some very kind of early work, and there's actually folks at the Media Lab that looked at this too. The last thing I'll mention is the skin. And so there's a lot of things with the skin. This is work by John Rogers, not our lab, but ideally there's a lot of electronics that can be put on the skin. There's lots of ways to explore the skin. There's a lot of work even there at the Media Lab. Cindy did a lot of this work. And lots of ways you'd want to interact with things on the skin. What we did is we looked at basically how you could modify temporary tattoos to have capacitive sensing and other kinds of strain gauges and such. So we used a very simple method for producing these that didn't require some highly sophisticated fabrication lab. And then now we can have, again, capacitive touch on the skin. There's no reason to kind of really be interacting through your phone. Again, it has to be things that make sense, but you could play games and you could also, we could detect some range of motion. So you can imagine, and we could send secret messages again. Here's someone's heart rate going through. Okay. So again, a lot of this work happened, and I'll just mention some of these have very long arcs because I don't know, this is maybe about a year or two ago. There was this project that was shown. This is basically at Adobe. They had created a hardware lab and they had created this dress that basically was expressive and could do kind of its own output. And again, it's not emissive. Let me just zip through. One of the things that it has is it has a mode where it actually has a sensor on it. So when you actually are moving, it also responds. So you could imagine this is showing this. And you might recognize This is Christy. This is the same graduate student that worked with me on many of those other projects. She went off to Adobe and is now doing this really tremendous work. So sometimes when you see these things, again, it's things that have been developed through a long arc. Okay, I've got many other projects. I'm going to tell you just one last thing about unmaking. And this is obviously there's a lot of things about physically making new things. There's a lot of chance to do things with digital fabrication. There's also, as you could tell, not surprisingly, very interested in artistic movements and artistic kind of histories and gestures. And one of them is Gustav Metzger, who talked about autodestructive art. So art that kind of destroys itself, or it basically inverts the well-established engineering principles of structurally sound designs and instead safely misusing unstable materials. We could demonstrate an important extension to making, that is unmaking. Now, unmaking basically is a way of thinking about, if you design something now, you might go into at least a digital version. You might do a CAD model and then you would basically print it out and have some final design. But how can that evolve over time? So how could it actually change? Maybe I would give you something that after it's inverted 5 times, it like separates or it falls apart. And I'm not gonna, this is just a couple sequences of, this is early work with Gustav Metzger doing things that would have these materials that would decay, or he used different kinds of materials that would degrade the different materials, basically. And again, people often, this is Jean Tanguy, who did a project that was actually a kind of gyrating mechanism at the Museum of Modern Art that kind of destroyed itself in an evening by falling apart. There's a Nikki de Saint-Phal, who was an artist that would paint paintings and then actually shoot at them and kind of destroy them. This is a little bit more contemporary. You maybe remember Banksy's artwork that was destroyed at auction. So again, all these are into this theme of kind of things that kind of change over time. And I also would say this is a very much a sustainability issue. Right now, we talk about this vocabulary of, when you model, it's like lift and cut, but if we had a different vocabulary that we could use when we make things, maybe we had things that sagged or cut or decayed, different kinds of things that we would want to do. And the point is that, I'll just zip to the, yeah, this is basically like you can create things that change over time. So we could have this bulge. We use different kinds of materials that explored this, or things that kind of almost erupted. Or in this case, you could kind of invert something and then it would sort of cause some reaction to occur. There's 2 parts to this. There's basically, I'm not going to talk about that project. It's an art piece destroying money. The point is, I wanted artists to think about exploring that space, but also the fact that I wanted people to think about not just designing for the final product, but how things would evolve and change over time. And as a designer, that has a sustainability story. And that led to a couple exemplars. This one, I'm just going to say very briefly because I want to leave some time for questions, but essentially, could we use this? This is this challenge. Can we design interactive electronics that are functional but are entirely decomposable? And in this case, this was using kind of like a leaf heater. We could have a leaf that basically, through some use of different kinds of materials, you can make it more conductive. It could actually heat up, and then it could actually perform. I'm going to just zip to the end. It's a little, this is an example is a package that you could sort of put something in. This is like a delicious cookie, and it would heat up. Again, it's just using an inductive material, so there's not a battery, but it can actually heat up, and you could even pasteurize something. It changes about 70 degrees Celsius. And so it has some interactivity. We're not designing, supercomputers. We're doing very simple interactions. We also, of course, the main point is you could take this entire design and put it into the ground and it'll decompose. This questionably delicious looking object is actually a battery. It's made out of a lot of different materials, cheese, and there's some, everything here is edible. Um, it's basically a supercapacitor, and you can use it to charge things and it'll function and you can recharge it. The point is you could also consume this battery. Okay, not the little copper leads here, but this was like an example in the lab. The idea is, again, we can now have a way to power things. And the last thing I'll mention is, because I talked about eating, you can also imagine, this was some work maybe a year or so ago that Catherine Song, a student that worked with me, led. And the idea was, could we create basically a way of having specific food interactions and tastes? And we were using a transducer, and we were basically, the way that we designed these pouches that had different mechanical properties. And so we kind of chose how we designed them in terms of wall thickness, and then they have a flavor in them. It's very much like, I know all you know, like boba tea. It's kind of very similar kind of um, fabrication technology. And these don't rupture in your mouth if you're holding them, unless you kind of bite down on them. But we could use a transducer from outside the body to actually choreograph when we wanted them to rupture. And we could choose which one we wanted. So we could choose a particular time or a flavor to release. So you could imagine there's lots of things you hold up to your head. It could be your phone, it could be a headset, it could be earphones, and we could create a food sensation in your mouth by rupturing it or causing it. In this case, you saw kind of a textural change, so it could feel different in your mouth. And the whole idea was, what does it mean to design these kind of food flavor texture experiences? What kinds of patterns would you have in there? And let's see. I think I will. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. A lot of cool people I got a chance to work with on this, and I'm gonna turn off my screen sharing so I can see all of you, and hopefully there's a little bit of time for some questions. I apologize if I went long. Um, Let me just hit some buttons here.
Wow.
Okay.
Thank you, Eric.
All right. Sorry for taking up all the time. I wish I was there. It's easier to have an interaction, so I apologize for just blasting through everything, but it's hard to go back and forth on Zoom, but.
No, thank you. This was very, very inspiring, Eric. I have so many questions. Maybe I start with the first one while everyone is getting ready for asking their questions. But wow, like what an incredible body of work, Eric, like across the scales, from edible to city to, it's just, I thought that we work across the design scales. You're definitely spanning across so many scales. So it is incredible to see that. I guess my question, I mean, your work in a way, it's showing to some extent also a hopeful, optimistic view toward also the role of designers as people who can potentially shape where the technology is going. And I'm just wondering, in what ways do you think we can empower or we can shape that conversation on the future direction of technology? What your thoughts are on that?
Yeah, and the thing that's like kind of maybe it's the elephant in the room is like the role of AI. I didn't really get into that kind of discussion. I mean, certainly, I think I view designers as completely like not getting the credit for what they do. I think sometimes they're often viewed as just putting on the kind of beautiful elements and kind of coming in late to projects and kind of making them functional for humans to use. And there's some degree of that happens, but I think even with AI, I've been thinking about, I mean, I'm still formulating my thoughts, so open to discussion, but like AI, I think, is like a design tool. So it kind of enhances how we design, right? It's very much like a tool. So the same way you might use Photoshop or Touch Designer, that's gonna be what you design is gonna be based on that tool set. So I think thinking through how it changes how we design as a tool, I'm thinking of it as a design material, right? So I'm sure you're thinking similarly. It's like, how does it transform what we design? It's a material that has some different kinds of expressive properties. I think also as a medium, so the same way It's like AI is a design medium, so it shapes how we experience design. So if you, the medium of, we talked about some of those projects even that I showed, but how do you, is it through voice or touch, or what is the medium of how we experience this? And AI is just another medium. And I think the powerful one is designing technologies that reimagine AI. And I think the reason I say that is it's like, I think sometimes it's like, oh, how are you going to bring AI into helping with design? I'm like, actually, you have it the wrong way around. AI actually needs design. And in fact, let's just be clear, AI is super powerful. It is touching all of our culture and society. We're not going to ignore it, but it clearly, it's something that mathematically it's a bunch of algorithms, data sets. It's a functional thing that has all these very specific statistical properties and mathematical properties, but who knows how we use and like embed and collaborate and feel this as a kind of creative partner in what we do. That's design. In fact, AI will, I would say, would absolutely fail if it doesn't have design. I think people just keep thinking of it as the main driver. I'm like, it really needs AI. I mean, sorry, it needs design to succeed. So sorry, it's a long answer. I don't know if I even got to the answer, but that's my thoughts on that.
No, I think I can't agree more that there's so much hyped around AI and if in its own way, but I think the role of design, I mean, especially in some of the examples that you showed, it's like not knowing exactly what you're doing or being rejected by so many conferences, but yet you're actually pushing the edge and you're actually defining what's possible. So thank you for showing all those examples and thank you for your answer. I want to make sure our students ask questions. Cyan, maybe come closer.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your talk. It was amazing. I think I have a similar question to Vinaz as well. You work across so many different modalities, but then also your work has a really interesting critical component, even depending on if it's design or practical, how it's implemented. And I'm really curious from your perspective for that critical aspect of the materials that you're exploring, what have you felt like is the most effective sort of platform, whether that's in academia, in a paper, or in more like those social urban interventions? Where have you felt like that message gets across the most and starts more dialogue, I guess?
Oh, yeah, great question. Well, it starts with the class you're probably in. I think this is one thing Vinaz and I are aligned on, which is like showcasing different kinds of ways of expressing outcome, or like just to use a goofy term, what's the people always talk return on investment, and it's not a dollar amount. It's like sometimes it's a shift in cultural perceptions. I would say, just to get down to what I think you're asking, you have to kind of gauge where sometimes it's best, like I mentioned earlier, like you publish a paper, but sometimes it's everything from, of course, typical art venues, like it might be whatever, Ars Electronica, or there's a long list of kind of new media, or you have some really great art spaces there in Cambridge there to show things. But I would say sometimes it's just interventions. I didn't really get into it, but a lot of the work and even class projects that I do and some of the research we'll just put out in public that kind of just for you to encounter. Um, I mean, the piece that Vinaz just had on the dome, I know it was like a year ago now, but it's all to say it was recent. It's quite kind of recent. That it wasn't like, what's the answer? What's going on? And there's like different ways to read that piece, but it's like that was supposed to capture a very different audience. And I think she writes about that in sort of architectural terms and in artistic terms, but also like sometimes it's just putting something out in public or having people experience it maybe online. I would say be creative with that. Yeah, I didn't talk about all the urban work, but almost all of that was like breaking norms about, we should do this typical user study and do this. I'm like, no, we're just going to do it a very different way. And in fact, have a conversation about whether that was the right thing to do. We learned something different. Would we make a product out of it? Probably not. That wasn't the point. We didn't want to make a product. We wanted to create some new kind of perspective or lens on a technology or critique it. So I don't know if that, again, that answers things, but I would say just be bold and adventurous. I don't know. During my sabbatical, I went into some archives specifically to look at how people that were social psychologists did their work kind of before there were IRBs. So where they basically deployed things. And it was fascinating to look at how they thought of public space and people. even that wearable stuff. It's like, just playing with those ideas. I think the big takeaway is, yes, you're going to take classes that teach you the like design method, and it's good to know those because I think you have to know something to properly deconstruct it. So know those and then know how to recollage them to get the impact you want. So
Thank you.
yeah.
Thank you, Eric. I'm aware of time. Are you able to get one more question?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's fine.
Is there any burning questions? Anyone brave? No final questions?
I have
Yes,
one
Sergio.
question. It's kind of a detailed question, but my ongoing project is also about like city intervention. And I was wondering how you did a participatory and community-based sensing project, because like how you made a sensing tool and distributed to the civic population to sense something and how it worked out.
Oh, I love that project. I'm glad you're doing that. I'm very curious. I want to see all the outcomes from this class too, by the way. I mean, I literally probably could have given a whole talk on just that domain because I would just in very broad strokes is certainly some things were like, how do these sensors work? How do you collect data? How do you log it? How do you visualize it? That's like probably the first take. But then if you look and like there were a lot of other projects that I kind of didn't even mention, but maybe showed, but I'll give you one as an example. We gave sensors to like different communities. We gave one to people who were parents. We gave sensors to people that were cyclists, to people that didn't have housing, pe activists, and we watched how they moved and wanted to kind of they wanted to share stories about their city based on that. So not surprisingly, some like parents wanted to be at parks where their kids were, and bicyclists wanted to demonstrate where the bike routes were, and activists had a different angle. People that were unhoused had a very different narrative. We just gave them these sensors, not knowing if we really get them back. And then it was great. We got sort of some interesting data from that. We did those kind of balloons you saw briefly, which we just handed out to people. We didn't give them big instructions. We just want to see, that was more open-ended. What would you do with this kind of object? Does it have any meaning? How does it invite conversation? And yes, if you were carrying a lit balloon that is changing colors, people come up to you. So it creates this instant interaction. But yeah, we did a lot of things that yeah, I don't know how to tell you, but if you look through some of that work from that period, it's hopefully that and others, it's kind of hopefully inspirational. It's not one kind of material, it's not one kind of thing, and it's often very specific to a community. And hopefully you have similar success in kind of targeting something. Again, I would go all the way back to whatever it was like the early slide, like look at who's not part of the conversation. How could they have a voice? And that's very much what we found, at least back then. People were, I don't know how I'd find out about the health in my city. I'd go to the Environmental Protection Agency and look at their data, but they would say everything's fine. But you'd say, no, there's like a dry cleaner down the street and there's something coming out of it. And I want to report that. A long history of this kind of stuff. And so I think that whole idea of citizen science feels very empowering and very much about democratizing kind of our technology and our data and giving everyone a voice. Oh yeah, please vote. Remember to vote coming up. So. Sorry, again, long answer. I love the project, though.
Thank you so much, Eric. You're very inspired. It's very inspiring to see all of the work that you showed. Lots to think about. So thank you so much for your time. And we are all very grateful for that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me. I hope to be out there soon and see all of you. And congrats on the cool class. And I'm very jealous of what's going on there. I would definitely be taking this class if I was out there. I would wear a wig, so Banaz wouldn't know who I am. I'd just be in the back.
We hopefully have you over here sometime very soon, Eric.
Yeah. No, always a pleasure to see you, and onward and upward. Like, I'm just totally loving your work. I show it all over the Berkeley here, so everyone knows you as a superstar.
Thank you. Take care. Have a good rest of the day.
All right, you too. Bye, everyone.